This was the Duke who gave his sister Emma in marriage to Ethelred, King of England, and who thereby formed connections with a country which his posterity was so soon after destined to subdue. The Danes had been established during a longer period in England than in France, and though the similarity of their original language to that of the Saxons invited them to a more early coalition with the natives, they had hitherto found so little example of civilized manners among the English that they retained all their ancient ferocity and valued themselves only on their national character of military bravery. The recent, as well as more ancient achievements of their countrymen tended to support this idea, and the English princes, particularly Athelstan and Edgar, sensible of that superiority, had been accustomed to keep in pay bodies of Danish troops who were quartered about the country and committed many violences upon the inhabitants. These mercenaries had attained to such a height of luxury, according to the Old English writers, that they combed their hair once a day, bathed themselves once a week, changed their clothes frequently, and by all these arts of effeminacy, as well as by their military character, had rendered themselves so agreeable to the fair sex that they debauched the wives and daughters of the English and dishonoured many families. But what most provoked the inhabitants was, that instead of defending them against invaders, they were ever ready to betray them to the foreign Danes, and to associate themselves with all straggling parties of that nation. The animosity between the inhabitants of English and Danish race had, from these repeated injuries, risen to a great height, when Ethelred, from a policy incident to weak princes, embraced the cruel resolution of massacring the latter throughout all his dominions. 1002. Secret orders were dispatched to commence the execution everywhere on the same day, and the festival of St. Brice, which fell on a Sunday, November 13, the day on which the Danes usually bathed themselves, was chosen for that purpose. It is needless to repeat the accounts transmitted concerning the barbarity of this massacre. The rage of the populace, excited by so many injuries, sanctioned by authority, and stimulated by example, distinguished not between innocence and guilt, spared neither sex nor age, and was not satiated without the tortures as well as death of the unhappy victims. Even Gunilda, sister to the King of Denmark, who had married Earl Paling and had embraced Christianity, was, by the advice of Edric, Earl of Wilts, seized and condemned to death by Ethelred after seeing her husband and children butchered before her face. This unhappy princess foretold, in the agonies of despair, that her murder would soon be avenged by the total ruin of the English nation. 1003. Never was prophecy better fulfilled, and never did barbarous policy prove more fatal to the authors. Sweyn and his Danes, who wanted but a pretence for invading the English, appeared off the western coast and threatened to take full revenge for the slaughter of their countrymen. Exeter fell first into their hands, from the negligence or treachery of Earl Hugh, a Norman, who had been made governor by the interest of Queen Emma. They began to spread their devastations over the country, when the English, sensible what outrages they must now expect from their barbarous and offended enemy, assembled more early and in greater numbers than usual, and made an appearance of vigorous resistance. But all these preparations were frustrated by the treachery of Duke Alfric, who was entrusted with the command, and who, feigning sickness, refused to lead the army against the Danes, till it was dispirited and at last dissipated by his fatal misconduct. Alfric soon after died, and Edric, a greater traitor than he, who had married the king's daughter and had acquired a total ascendant over him, succeeded Alfric in the government of Mercia and in the command of the English armies. A great famine, proceeding partly from the bad seasons, partly from the decay of agriculture, added to all the other miseries of the inhabitants. 107. The country, wasted by the Danes, harassed by the fruitless expeditions of its own forces, was reduced to the utmost desolation, and at last submitted to the infamy of purchasing a precarious peace from the enemy by the payment of £30,000. The English endeavoured to employ this interval in making preparations against the return of the Danes, which they had reason soon to expect. A law was made, ordering the proprietors of 8 hides of land to provide each a horseman and a complete suit of armour, and those of 310 hides to equip a ship for the defence of the coast. When this navy was assembled, which must have consisted of near 800 vessels, all hopes of its success were disappointed by the factions, animosities, and dissensions of the nobility. Edric had impelled his brother Breitric to prefer an accusation of treason against Wulfnoth, governor of Sussex, the father of the famous Earl Godwin, and that nobleman, well acquainted with the malevolence as well as power of his enemy, found no means of safety due in deserting with 20 ships to the Danes. Brithric pursued him with a fleet of 80 sail, but his ships being shattered in a tempest and stranded on the coast, he was suddenly attacked by Wulfnoth, and all his vessels burnt and destroyed. The imbecility of the king was little capable of repairing this misfortune. The treachery of Edric frustrated every plan for future defence, and the English navy, disconcerted, discouraged, and divided, was at last scattered into its several harbours. It is almost impossible, or would be tedious, to relate particularly all the miseries to which the English were henceforth exposed. We hear of nothing but the sacking and burning of towns, the devastation of the open country, the appearance of the enemy in every quarter of the kingdom, their cruel diligence in discovering any corner which had not been ransacked by their former violence. The broken and disjointed narration of the ancient historians is here well adapted to the nature of the war, which was conducted by such sudden inroads as would have been dangerous even to a united and well-governed kingdom, but proved fatal where nothing but a general consternation and mutual diffidence and dissension prevailed. The governors of one province refused to march to the assistance of another, and were at last terrified from assembling their forces for the defence of their own province. General councils were summoned, but either no resolution was taken, or none was carried into execution, and the only expedient in which the English agreed was the base and imprudent one of buying a new peace from the Danes by the payment of £48,000. 1011. This measure did not bring them even that short interval of repose which they had expected from it. The Danes, disregarding all engagements, continued their devastations and hostilities, levied a new contribution of £8,000 upon the county of Kent alone, murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had refused to countenance this exaction, and the English nobility found no other resource than that of submitting everywhere to the Danish monarch, swearing allegiance to him and delivering him hostages for their fidelity. Ethelred, equally afraid of the violence of the enemy and the treachery of his own subjects, fled into Normandy 2013, whither he had sent before him Queen Emma and her 2 sons, Alfred and Edward. Richard received his unhappy guests with a generosity that does honour to his memory. 24. The king had not been above 6 weeks in Normandy when he heard of the death of Sweyn, who expired at Gainsborough, before he had time to establish himself in his new acquired dominions. The English prelates and nobility, taking advantage of this event, sent over a deputation to Normandy, inviting Ethelred to return to them, expressing a desire of being again governed by their native prince, and intimating their hopes that, being now tutored by experience, he would avoid all those errors which had been attended with such misfortunes to himself and to his people. But the misconduct of Ethelred was incurable, and on his resuming the government, he discovered the same incapacity, indolence, cowardice, and credulity which had so often exposed him to the insults of his enemies. His son-in-law Edric, notwithstanding his repeated treasons, retained such influence at court as to instill into the king jealousies of Sigefert and Morcar, 2 of the chief nobles of Mercia. Edric allured them into his house, where he murdered them, while Ethelred participated in the infamy of the action by confiscating their estates and thrusting into a convent the widow of Sigefert. She was a woman of singular beauty and merit, and in a visit which was paid her during her confinement by Prince Edmond, the king's eldest son, she inspired him with so violent an affection that he released her from the convent and soon after married her without the consent of his father. Meanwhile, the English found in Cnut, the son and successor of Sweyn, an enemy no less terrible than the prince from whom death had so lately delivered them. He ravaged the eastern coast with merciless fury and put ashore all the English hostages at Sandwich after having cut off their hands and noses. He was obliged, by the necessity of his affairs, to make a voyage to Denmark, but, returning soon after, he continued his depredations along the southern coast. He even broke into the counties of Dorset, Wilts, and Somerset, where an army was assembled against him under the command of Prince Edmund and Duke Edric. The latter still continued his perfidious machinations, and after endeavouring in vain to get the prince into his power, he found means to disperse the army, and he then openly deserted to Cnut with 40 vessels. 1015. Notwithstanding this misfortune, Edmund was not disconcerted, but assembling all the force of England was in a condition to give battle to the enemy. The king had had such frequent experience of perfidy among his subjects that he had lost all confidence in them. He remained at London, pretending sickness, but really from apprehensions that they intended to buy their peace by delivering him into the hands of his enemies. The army called aloud for their sovereign to march at their head against the Danes, and, on his refusal to take the field, they were so discouraged that those vast preparations became ineffectual for the defence of the kingdom. Edmund, deprived of all regular supplies to maintain his soldiers, was obliged to commit equal ravages with those which were practised by the Danes, and, after making some fruitless expeditions into the north, which had submitted entirely to Cnut's power, he retired to London, determined there to maintain to the last extremity the small remains of English liberty. He here found everything in confusion by the death of the king, who expired after an unhappy and inglorious reign of 35 years. 1016. He left 2 sons by his first marriage, Edmund, who succeeded him, and Edwy, whom Cnut afterwards murdered. His 2 sons by the second marriage, Anred and Edward, were, immediately upon Ethelred's death, conveyed into Normandy by Queen Emma. Edmond Ironside. This prince, who received the name of Ironside from his hardy valour, possessed courage and abilities sufficient to have prevented his country from sinking into those calamities, but not to raise it from that abyss of misery into which it had already fallen. Among the other misfortunes of the English, treachery and disaffection had crept in among the nobility and prelates, and Edmund found no better expedient for stopping the further progress of these fatal evils than to lead his army instantly into the field and to employ them against the common enemy. After meeting with some success at Gillingham, he prepared himself to decide, in one general engagement, the fate of his crown, and at Scurston, in the county of Gloucester, he offered battle to the enemy, who were commanded by Cnut and Edric. Fortune, in the beginning of the day, declared for him, but Edric, having cut off the head of one Osmer, whose countenance resembled that of Edmund, fixed it on a spear, carried it through the ranks in triumph, and called aloud to the English that it was time to fly, for, behold, the head of their sovereign. And though Edmund, observing the consternation of the troops, took off his helmet and showed himself to them, the utmost he could gain by his activity and valour was to leave the victory undecided. Edric now took a surer method to ruin him, by pretending to desert to him, and as Edmund was well acquainted with his power, and probably knew no other of the chief nobility in whom he could repose more confidence, he was obliged, notwithstanding the repeated perfidy of the man, to give him a considerable command in the army. A battle soon after ensued at Assington, in Essex, where Edric, flying in the beginning of the day, occasioned the total defeat of the English, followed by a great slaughter of the nobility. The indefatigable Edmund, however, had still resources. Assembling a new army at Gloucester, he was again in condition to dispute the field, when the Danish and English nobility, equally harassed with those convulsions, obliged their kings to come to a compromise and to divide the kingdom between them by treaty. Cnut reserved to himself the northern division, consisting of Mercia, East Anglia and Northumberland, which he had entirely subdued. The southern parts were left to Edmund. The prince survived the treaty about a month. He was murdered at Oxford by 2 of his chamberlains, accomplices of Edric, who thereby made way for the succession of Cnut the Dane to the crown of England. Cnut 1017. The English, who had been unable to defend their country and maintain their independency under so active and brave a prince as Edmund, could, after his death, expect nothing but total subjection from Cnut, who, active and brave himself, and at the head of a great force, was ready to take advantage of the minority of Edwin and Edward, the 2 sons of Edmund. Yet this conqueror, who was commonly so little scrupulous, showed himself anxious to cover his injustice under plausible pretences. Before he seized the dominions of the English princes, he summoned a general assembly of the states in order to fix the succession of the kingdom. He here suborned some nobles to depose that, in the Treaty of Gloucester, it had been verbally agreed either to name Cnut, in case of Edmund's death, successor to his dominions, or tutor to his children. The historians vary in this particular, and that evidence, supported by the great power of Cnut, determined the states immediately to put the Danish monarch in possession of the government. Cnut, jealous of the 2 princes, but sensible that he should render himself extremely odious if he ordered them to be dispatched in England, sent them abroad to his ally, the King of Sweden, whom he desired, as soon as they arrived at his court, to free him by their death from and farther anxiety. The Swedish monarch was too generous to comply with the request, but being afraid of drawing on himself a quarrel with Cnut, by protecting the young princes, he sent them to Solomon, king of Hungary, to be educated in his court. The elder, Edwin, was afterwards married to the sister of the king of Hungary, but the English prince dying without issue, Solomon gave his sister-in-law Agatha, daughter of the Emperor Henry II, in marriage to Edward, the younger brother, and she bore him Edgar, Atheling, Margaret, afterwards Queen of Scotland, and Christina, who retired into a convent. Cnut, though he had reached the great point of his ambition in obtaining possession of the English crown, was obliged at first to make great sacrifices to it, and to gratify the chief of the nobility by bestowing on them the most extensive governments and jurisdictions. He created Thurkill Earl, or Duke of East Anglia, for these titles were then nearly of the same import, Uric of Northumberland and Edric of Mercia, reserving only to himself the administration of Wessex. But seizing afterwards a favourable opportunity, he expelled Thurkill and Uric from their governments, and banished them the kingdom. He put to death many of the English nobility, on whose fidelity he could not rely, and whom he hated on account of their disloyalty to their native prince. And even the traitor Edric, having had the assurance to reproach him with his services, was condemned to be executed, and his body to be thrown into the Thames, a suitable reward for his multiplied acts of perfidy and rebellion. Cnut also found himself obliged, in the beginning of his reign, to load the people with heavy taxes. In order to reward his Danish followers, he exacted from them at one time the sum of £72,000, besides £11,000 which he levied on London alone. He was probably willing, from political motives, to mulct severely that city, on account of the affection which it had borne to Edmund, and the resistance which it had made to the Danish power in 2 obstinate sieges. But these rigours were imputed to necessity, and Cnut, like a wise prince, was determined that the English, now deprived of all their dangerous leaders, should be reconciled to the Danish yoke by the justice and impartiality of his administration. He sent back to Denmark as many of his followers as he could safely spare. He restored the Saxon customs in a general assembly of the states. He made no distinction between Danes and English in the distribution of justice, and he took care, by a strict execution of law, to protect the lives and properties of all his people. The Danes were gradually incorporated with his new objects, and both were glad to obtain a little respite from those multiplied calamities, from which the one, no less than the other, had, in their fierce contest for power, experienced such fatal consequences. The removal of Edmund's children into so distant a country as Hungary was, next to their death, regarded by Cnut as the greatest security to his government. He had no further anxiety, except with regard to Alfred and Edward, who were protected and supported by their uncle Richard, Duke of Normandy. Richard even fitted out a great armament in order to restore the English princes to the throne of their ancestors, and though the navy was dispersed by a storm, Cnut saw the danger to which he was exposed from the enmity of so warlike a people as the Normans. In order to acquire the friendship of the Duke, he paid his addresses to Queen Emma, sister of that prince, and promised that he would leave the children, whom he should have by that marriage, in possession of the crown of England. Richard complied with his demand, and sent over Emma to England, where she was soon after married to Cnut. The English, though they disapproved of her espousing the mortal enemy of her former husband and his family, were pleased to find at court a sovereign to whom they were accustomed, and who had already formed connections with them, and thus Cnut, besides securing, by this marriage, the alliance of Normandy, gradually acquired, by the same means, the confidence of his own subjects. The Norman prince did not long survive the marriage of Emma, and he left the inheritance of the duchy to his eldest son of the same name, who, dying a year after him without children, was succeeded by his brother Robert, a man of valour and abilities. Cnut, having settled his power in England beyond all danger of a revolution, made a voyage to Denmark in order to resist the attacks of the King of Sweden, and he carried along with him a great body of the English under the command of Earl Godwin. This nobleman had here an opportunity of performing a service, by which he both reconciled the king's mind to the English nation, and gaining to himself the friendship of his sovereign, laid the foundation of that immense fortune which he acquired to his family. He was stationed next the Swedish camp, and observing a favourable opportunity, which he was obliged suddenly to seize, he attacked the enemy in the night, drove them from their trenches, threw them into disorder, pursued his advantage, and obtained a decisive victory over them. Next morning, Cnut, seeing the English camp entirely abandoned, imagined that those disaffected troops had deserted to the enemy. He was agreeably surprised to find that they were at that time engaged in pursuit of the discomfited Swedes. He was so pleased with this success, and with the manner of obtaining it, that he bestowed his daughter in marriage upon Godwin, and treated him ever after with entire confidence and regard. 2028. In another voyage, which he made afterwards to Denmark, Cnut attacked Norway, and expelling the just but unwarlike Olaus, kept possession of his kingdom till the death of that prince. He had now by his conquests and valour attained the utmost height of grandeur. Having leisure from wars and intrigues, he felt the unsatisfactory nature of all human enjoyments, and equally weary of the glories and turmoils of this life, he began to cast his view towards that future existence, which it is so natural for the human mind, whether satiated by prosperity or disgusted with adversity, to make the object of its attention. Unfortunately, the spirit which prevailed in that age gave a wrong direction to his devotion. Instead of making compensation to those whom he had injured by his former acts of violence, he employed himself entirely in those exercises of piety which the monks represented as the most meritorious. He built churches, he endowed monasteries, he enriched the ecclesiastics, and he bestowed revenues for the support of chantries at Assington and other places, where he appointed prayers to be said for the souls of those who had there fallen in battle against him. He even undertook a pilgrimage to Rome, where he resided a considerable time. Besides obtaining from the Pope some privileges for the English school erected there, he engaged all the princes, through whose dominions he was obliged to pass, to desist from those heavy impositions and tolls which they were accustomed to exact from the English pilgrims. By this spirit of devotion, no less than by his equitable and politic administration, he gained, in a good measure, the affections of his subjects. Cnut, the greatest and most powerful monarch of his time, sovereign of Denmark and Norway, as well as of England, could not fail of meeting with adulation from his courtiers, a tribute which is liberally paid even to the meanest and weakest princes. Some of his flatterers, breaking out one day in admiration of his grandeur, exclaimed that everything was possible for him, upon which the monarch, it is said, ordered his chair to be set on the seashore, while the tide was rising, and as the waters approached, he commanded them to retire, and to obey the voice of him who was lord of the ocean. He feigned to sit some time in expectation of their submission, but when the sea still advanced towards him, and began to wash him with its billows, he turned to his courtiers and remarked to them that every creature in the universe was feeble and impotent, and that power resided with one being alone, in whose hands were all the elements of nature, who could say to the ocean, "Thus far shalt thou go, and no farther," and who could level with his nod the most towering piles of human pride and ambition. 1031. The only memorable action which Cnut performed after his return from Rome was an expedition against Malcolm, King of Scotland. During the reign of Ethelred, a tax of 1 shilling a hide had been imposed on all the lands of England. It was commonly called Danegeld, because the revenue bar been employed either in buying peace with the Danes or in making preparations against the inroads of that hostile nation. That monarch had required that the same tax should be paid by Cumberland, which was held by the Scots, but Malcolm, a warlike prince, told him that as he was always able to repulse the Danes by his own power, he would neither submit to buy peace of his enemies, nor pay others for resisting them. Ethelred, offended at this reply, which contained a secret reproach on his own conduct, undertook an expedition against Cumberland, but though he committed ravages upon the country, he could never bring Malcolm to a temper more humble or submissive. Cnut, after his accession, summoned the Scottish king to acknowledge himself a vassal for Cumberland to the crown of England, but Malcolm refused compliance, on pretence that he owed homage to those princes only who inherited that kingdom by right of blood. Cnut was not of a temper to bear this insult, and the King of Scotland soon found that the sceptre was in very different hands from those of the feeble and irresolute Ethelred. Upon Cnut's appearing on the frontiers with a formidable army, Malcolm agreed that his grandson and heir Duncan, whom he put in possession of Cumberland, should make the submissions required, and that the heirs of Scotland should always acknowledge themselves vassals to England for that province. Cnut passed 4 years in peace after this enterprise, and he died at Shaftesbury, leaving 3 sons, Sweyn, Harold, and Hardicanute. Sweyn, whom he had by his first marriage with Alfwen, daughter of the Earl of Hampshire, was crowned in Norway. Hardicanute, whom Emma had borne him, was in possession of Denmark. Harold, who was of the same marriage with Sweyn, was at that time in England. Harold, Harefoot 135. Though Cnut, in his treaty with Richard, Duke of Normandy, had stipulated that his children by Emma should succeed to the crown of England, he had either considered himself as released from that engagement by the death of Richard, or esteemed it dangerous to leave an unsettled and newly conquered kingdom in the hands of so young a prince as Hardicanute. He therefore appointed, by his will, Harold's successor to the crown. This prince was besides present. To maintain his claim, he was favoured by all the Danes, and he got immediately possession of his father's treasures, which might be equally useful, whether he found it necessary to proceed by force or intrigue, in ensuring his succession. On the other hand, Hardicanute had the suffrages of the English, who, on account of his being from among them of Queen Emma, regarded him as their countryman. He was favoured by the articles of treaty with the Duke of Normandy, and above all his party was espoused by Earl Godwin, the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom, especially in the province of Wessex, the chief seat of the ancient English. Affairs were likely to terminate in a civil war, when, by the interposition of the nobility of both parties, a compromise was made, and it was agreed that Harold should enjoy, together with London, all the provinces north of the Thames, while the possession of the south should remain to Hardicanute. Until that prince should appear and take possession of his dominions, Emma fixed her residence at Winchester, and established her authority over her son's share of the partition. Meanwhile, Robert, Duke of Normandy, died in a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and being succeeded by a son, yet a minor, the two English princes, Alfred and Edward, who found no longer any countenance or protection in that country, gladly embraced the opportunity of paying a visit, with a numerous retinue, to their mother Emma, who seemed to be placed in a state of so much power and splendour at Winchester. But the face of affairs soon wore a melancholy aspect. Earl Godwin had been gained by the arts of Harold, who promised to espouse the daughter of that nobleman, and while the treaty was yet a secret, these two tyrants laid a plan for the destruction of the English princes. Alfred was invited to London by Harold with many professions of friendship, but when he had reached Guildford he was set upon by Godwin's vassals. About 600 of his train were murdered in the most cruel manner. He himself was taken prisoner, his eyes were put out, and he was conducted to the monastery of Ely, where he died soon after. Edward and Emma, apprised of the fate which was awaiting them, fled beyond sea, the former into Normandy, the latter into Flanders, while Harold, triumphing in his bloody policy, took possession, without resistance, of all the dominions assigned to his brother. This is the only memorable action performed during a reign of 4 years by this prince, who gave so bad a specimen of his character, and whose bodily accomplishments alone are known to us by his appellation of Harefoot, which he acquired from his agility in running and walking. He died on the 14th of April, 1039, little regretted or esteemed by his subjects, and left the succession open to his brother Hardicanute, 1039. Hardicanute, or Canute the Hardy, that is, the robust, for he is chiefly known by his bodily accomplishments, though by remaining so long in Denmark he had been deprived of his share in the partition of the kingdom, had not abandoned his pretensions, and he had determined, before Harold's death, to recover by arms what he had lost, either by his own negligence or by the necessity of his affairs. On pretence of paying a visit to the Queen Dowager in Flanders, Ney had assembled a fleet of 60 sail, and was preparing to make a descent on England, when intelligence of his brother's death induced him to sail immediately to London, where he was received in triumph and acknowledged king without opposition. The first act of Hardicanute's government afforded his subjects a bad prognostic of his future conduct. He was so enraged at Harold for depriving him of his share of the kingdom, and for the cruel treatment of his brother Alfred, that in an impotent desire of revenge against the dead, he ordered his body to be dug up and to be thrown into the Thames. And when it was found by some fishermen and buried in London, he ordered it again to be dug up and to be thrown again into the river, but it was fished up a second time, and then interred with great secrecy. Godwin, equally servile and insolent, submitted to be his instrument in this unnatural and brutal action. That nobleman knew that he was universally believed to have been an accomplice in the barbarity exercised on Alfred, and that he was on that account obnoxious to Hardicanute, and perhaps he hoped, by displaying this rage against Harold's memory, to justify himself from having had any participation in his councils. But Prince Edward, being invited over by the king, immediately on his appearance preferred an accusation against Godwin for the murder of Alfred, and demanded justice for that crime. Godwin, in order to appease the king, made him a magnificent present of a galley with a gilt stern, rowed by 80 men, who wore each of them a gold bracelet on his arm, weighing 16 ounces, and were armed and clothed in the most sumptuous manner. Hardicanute, pleased with the splendour of this spectacle, quickly forgot his brother's murder, and on Godwin's swearing that he was innocent of the crime, he allowed him to be acquitted. Though Hardicanute before his accession had been called over by the vows of the English, he soon lost the affections of the nation by his misconduct, but nothing appeared more grievous to them than his renewing the imposition of Danegeld and obliging the nation to pay a great sum of money to the fleet which brought him from Denmark. The discontents ran high in many places. In Worcester the populace rose and put to death 2 of the collectors. The king, enraged at this opposition, swore vengeance against the city, and ordered 3 noblemen, Godwin, Duke of Wessex, Siward, Duke of Northumberland, and Leofric, Duke of Mercia, to execute his menaces with the utmost rigour. They were obliged to set fire to the city and deliver it up to be plundered by their soldiers, but they saved the lives of the inhabitants, whom they confined in a small island of the 7, called Beverey, till, by their intercession, they were able to appease the king and obtain the pardon of the supplicants. This violent government was of short duration. Hardicanute died in 2 years after his accession, at the nuptials of a Danish lord, which he had honoured with his presence. His usual habits of intemperance were so well known that, notwithstanding his robust constitution, his sudden death gave as little surprise as it did sorrow to his subjects. Edward the Confessor. 1041. The English, on the death of Hardicanute, saw a favourable opportunity for recovering their liberty, and for shaking off the Danish yoke under which they had so long laboured. Sweyn, King of Norway, the eldest son of Canute, was absent, and as the 2 last kings had died without issue, none of that race presented himself, nor any whom the Danes could support as successor to the throne. Prince Edward was fortunately at court on his brother's demise, and though the descendants of Edmond Ironside were the true heirs of the Saxon family, yet their absence in so remote a country as Hungary appeared a sufficient reason for their exclusion to a people, like the English, so little accustomed to observe a regular order in the succession of their monarchs. All delays might be dangerous, and the present occasion must hastily be embraced, while the Danes, without concert, without a leader, astonished at the present incident, and anxious only for their personal safety, durst not oppose the united voice of the nation. But this concurrence of circumstances in favour of Edward might have failed of its effect, had his succession been opposed by Godwin, whose power, alliances, and abilities gave him a great influence at all times, especially amidst those sudden opportunities which always attend a revolution of government, and which, either seized or neglected, commonly prove decisive. There were opposite reasons which divided men's hopes and fears with regard to Godwin's conduct. On the one hand, the credit of that nobleman lay chiefly in Wessex, which was almost entirely inhabited by English. It was therefore presumed that he would second the wishes of that people in restoring the Saxon line, and in humbling the Danes, from whom he, as well as they, had reason to dread, as they had already felt, the most grievous oppressions. On the other hand, there subsisted a declared animosity between Edward and Godwin on account of Alfred's murder, of which the latter had publicly been accused by the prince, and which he might believe so deep an offence as could never, on account of any subsequent merits, be sincerely pardoned. But their common friends here interposed, and representing the necessity of their good correspondence, obliged them to lay aside all jealousy and rancour, and concur in restoring liberty to their native country. Godwin only stipulated that Edward, as a pledge of his sincere reconciliation, should promise to marry his daughter Editha, and having fortified himself by this alliance, he summoned a general council at Gillingham, and prepared every measure for securing the succession to Edward. The English were unanimous and zealous in their resolutions. The Danes were divided and dispirited. Any small opposition which appeared in this assembly was browbeaten and suppressed, and Edward was crowned king, with every demonstration of duty and affection. The triumph of the English upon this signal and decisive advantage was at first attended with some insult and violence against the Danes, But the king, by the mildness of his character, soon reconciled the latter to his administration, and the distinction between the two nations gradually disappeared. The Danes were interspersed with the English in most of the provinces. They spoke nearly the same language. They differed little in their manners and laws. Domestic dissensions in Denmark prevented, for some years, any powerful invasion from thence which might awaken past animosities, and as the Norman conquest, which ensued soon after, reduced both nations to equal subjection, there is no further mention in history of any difference between them. The joy, however, of their present deliverance made such impression on the minds of the English that they instituted an annual festival for celebrating that great event, and it was observed in some counties, even to the time of Spelman. The popularity which Edward enjoyed on his accession was not destroyed by the first act of his administration, his resuming all the grants of his immediate predecessors, an attempt which is commonly attended with the most dangerous consequences. The poverty of the crown convinced the nation that this act of violence was become absolutely necessary, and as the loss fell chiefly on the Danes, who had obtained large grants from the late kings, their countrymen, on account of their services in subduing the kingdom, the English were rather pleased to see them reduced to their primitive poverty. The king's severity also towards his mother, the Queen Dowager, though exposed to some more censure, met not with very general disapprobation. He had hitherto lived on indifferent terms with that princess. He accused her of neglecting him and his brother during their adverse fortune. He remarked that, as the superior qualities of Cnut and his better treatment of her had made her entirely indifferent to the memory of Ethelred, she also gave the preference to her children of the second bed, and always regarded Hardicanute as her favourite. The same reasons had probably made her unpopular in England, and though her benefactions to the monks obtained her the favour of that order, the nation was not, in general, displeased to see her stripped by Edward of immense treasures which she had amassed. He confined her, during the remainder of her life, in a monastery at Winchester, but carried his rigour against her no farther. The stories of his accusing her of a participation in her son Alfred's murder, and of a criminal correspondence with the Bishop of Winchester, and also of her justifying herself by treading barefoot, without receiving any hurt, over 9 burning ploughshares, were the inventions of the monkish historians, and were propagated and believed from the silly wonder of posterity. The English flattered themselves that, by the accession of Edward, they were delivered forever from the dominion of foreigners, but they soon found that this evil was not yet entirely removed. The king had been educated in Normandy, and had contracted many intimacies with the natives of that country, as well as an affection for their manners. The court of England was soon filled with Normans, who, being distinguished both by the favour of Edward and by a degree of cultivation superior to that which was attained by the English in those ages, soon rendered their language, customs, and laws fashionable in the kingdom. The study of the French tongue became general among the people. The courtiers affected to imitate that nation in their dress, equipage, and entertainments. Even the lawyers employed a foreign language in their deeds and papers. But above all, the Church felt the influence and dominion of those strangers. Ulf and William, 2 Normans, who had formerly been the king's chaplains, were created bishops of Dorchester and London. Robert, a Norman also, was promoted to the See of Canterbury, and always enjoyed the highest favour of his master, of which his abilities rendered him not unworthy. And though the king's prudence, or his want of authority, made him confer almost all the civil and military employments on the natives, the ecclesiastical preferments fell often to the share of the Normans, and as the latter possessed Edward's confidence, they had secretly a great influence on public affairs, and excited the jealousy of the English, particularly of Earl Godwin. This powerful nobleman, besides being Duke or Earl of Wessex, had the counties of Kent and Sussex annexed to his government. His eldest son, Sweyn, possessed the same authority in the counties of Oxford, Berks, Gloucester, and Hereford, and Harold, his second son, was Duke of East Anglia, and at the same time Governor of Essex. The great authority of this family was supported by immense possessions and powerful alliances, and the abilities, as well as ambition of Godwin himself, contributed to render it still more dangerous. A prince of greater capacity and vigour than Edward would have found it difficult to support the dignity of the crown under such circumstances, and as the haughty temper of Godwin made him often forget the respect due to his Prince Edward's animosity against him, was grounded on personal as well as political considerations, on recent as well as more ancient injuries. The king, in pursuance of his engagements, had indeed married Editha, the daughter of Godwin, but this alliance became a fresh source of enmity between them. Edward's hatred of the father was transferred to that princess, and Editha, though possessed of many amiable accomplishments, could never acquire the confidence and affection of her husband. It is even pretended that, during the whole course of her life, he abstained from all commerce of love with her, and such was the absurd admiration paid to an inviolable chastity during those ages, that his conduct in this particular is highly celebrated by the monkish historians, and greatly contributed to his acquiring the title of Saint and Confessor 1048. The most popular pretence on which Godwin could ground his disaffection to the king and his administration was to complain of the influence of the Normans in the government, and a declared opposition had thence arisen between him and these favourites. It was not long before this animosity broke out into action. Eustace, Count of Boulogne, having paid a visit to the king, passed by Dover in his return, one of his train, being refused entrance to a lodging which had been assigned him, attempted to make his way by force, and in the contest he wounded the master of the house. The inhabitants revenged this insult by the death of the stranger. The count and his train took arms and murdered the wounded townsman. A tumult ensued. Near 20 persons were killed on each side, and Eustace, being overpowered by numbers, was obliged to save his life by flight from the fury of the populace. He hurried immediately to court and complained of the usage he had met with. The king entered zealously into the quarrel, and was highly displeased that a stranger of such distinction, whom he had invited over to his court, should, without any just cause, as he believed, have felt so sensibly the insolence and animosity of his people. He gave orders to Godwin, in whose government Dover lay, to repair immediately to the place, and to punish the inhabitants for any crime. But Godwin, who desired rather to encourage than express the popular discontents against foreigners, refused obedience, and endeavoured to throw the whole blame of the riot on the Count of Boulogne and his retinue. Edward, touched in so sensible a point, saw the necessity of exerting the royal authority, and he threatened Godwin, if he persisted in his disobedience, to make him feel the utmost effects of his resentment. The Earl, perceiving a rupture to be unavoidable, and pleased to embark in a cause where it was likely he should be supported by his countrymen, made preparations for his own defence, or rather for an attack on Edward. Under pretence of repressing some disorders on the Welsh frontier, he secretly assembled a great army, and was approaching the king, who resided, without any military force and without suspicion, at Gloucester. Edward applied for protection to Siward, Duke of Northumberland, and Leofric, Duke of Mercia, 2 powerful noblemen, whose jealousy of Godwin's greatness, as well as their duty to the crown, engaged them to defend the king in this extremity. They hastened to him with such of their followers as they could assemble on a sudden, and finding the danger much greater than they had at first apprehended, they issued orders for mustering all the forces within their respective governments, and for marching them without delay to the defence of the king's person and authority. Edward, meanwhile, endeavoured to gain time by negotiation, while Godwin, who thought the king entirely in his power, and who was willing to save appearances, fell into the snare, and not sensible that he ought to have no further reserve after he had proceeded so far, he lost the favourable opportunity of rendering himself master of the government. The English, though they had no high idea of Edward's vigour and capacity, bore him great affection on account of his humanity, justice, and piety, as well as the long race of their native kings, from whom he was descended, and they hastened from all quarters to defend him from the present danger. His army was now so considerable that he ventured to take the field, and marching to London, he summoned a great council to judge of the rebellion of Godwin and his sons. These noblemen pretended at first that they were willing to stand their trial, but having in vain endeavoured to make their adherents persist in rebellion, they offered to come to London, provided they might receive hostages for their safety. This proposal being rejected, they were obliged to disband the remains of their forces and have recourse to flight. Baldwin, Earl of Flanders, gave protection to Godwin and his 3 sons, Gurth, Sweyn, and Tosti, the latter of whom had married the daughter of that prince. Harold and Leofwin, 2 others of his sons, took shelter in Ireland. The estates of the father and sons were confiscated, their governments were given to others, Queen Editha was confined in a monastery at Wherwell, and the greatness of this family, once so formidable, seemed now to be totally supplanted and overthrown. But Godwin had fixed his authority on too firm a basis, and he was too strongly supported by alliances, both foreign and domestic, not to occasion further disturbances and make new efforts for his re-establishment. 952. The Earl of Flanders permitted him to purchase and hire ships within his harbours, and Godwin, having manned them with his followers and with freebooters of all nations, put to sea and attempted to make a descent at Sandwich. The king, informed of his preparations, had equipped a considerable fleet, much superior to that of the enemy, and the earl hastily, before their appearance, made his retreat into the Flemish harbours. The English court, allured by the present security, and destitute of all vigorous counsels, allowed the seamen to disband and the fleet to go to decay, while Godwin, expecting this event, kept his men in readiness for action. He put to sea immediately and sailed to the Isle of Wight, where he was joined by Harold with a squadron, which that nobleman had collected in Ireland. He was now master of the sea, and entering every harbour in the southern coast, he seized all the ships, and summoned his followers in those counties, which had so long been subject to his government, to assist him in procuring justice to himself, his family, and his country, against the tyranny of foreigners. Reinforced by great numbers from all quarters, he entered the Thames, and appearing before London, threw everything into confusion. The king alone seemed resolute to defend himself to the last extremity, but the interposition of the English nobility, many of whom favoured Godwin's pretensions, made Edward hearken to terms of accommodation, and the feigned humility of the earl, who disclaimed all intentions of offering violence to his sovereign, and desired only to justify himself by a fair and open trial, paved the way for his more easy admission. It was stipulated that he should give hostages for his good behaviour, and that the primate and all the foreigners should be banished. By this treaty the present danger of a civil war was obviated, but the authority of the crown was considerably impaired, or rather entirely annihilated. Edward, sensible that he had not power sufficient to secure Godwin's hostages in England, sent them over to his kinsman, the young Duke of Normandy. Godwin's death, which happened soon after, while he was sitting at table with the king, prevented him from further establishing the authority which he had acquired, and from reducing Edward to still greater subjection. 5. He was succeeded in the government of Wessex, Sussex, Kent, and Essex, and in the office of steward of the household, a place of great power, by his son Harold, who was actuated by an ambition equal to that of his father, and was superior to him in address, in insinuation, and in virtue. By a modest and gentle demeanour, he acquired the goodwill of Edward, at least, softened that hatred which the prince had so long borne his family, and gaining every day new partisans by his bounty and affability, he proceeded, in a more silent and therefore a more dangerous manner, to the increase of his authority. The king, who had not sufficient vigour directly to oppose his progress, knew of no other expedient than that hazardous one of raising him a rival in the family of Leofric, Duke of Mercia, whose son Algar was invested with the government of East Anglia, which, before the banishment of Harold, had belonged to the latter nobleman. But this policy, of balancing opposite parties, required a more steady hand to manage it than that of Edward, and naturally produced faction and even civil broils among nobles of such mighty and independent authority. Algar was soon after expelled his government by the intrigues and power of Harold, but being protected by Griffith, Prince of Wales, who had married his daughter, as well as by the power of his father Leofric, he obliged Harold to submit to an accommodation, and was reinstated in the government of East Anglia. This peace was not of long duration. Harold, taking advantage of Leofric's death, which happened soon after, expelled Algar anew and banished him the kingdom. And though that nobleman made a fresh eruption into East Anglia with an army of Norwegians and overran the country, his death soon freed Harold from the pretensions of so dangerous a rival. Edward, the eldest son of Algar, was indeed advanced to the government of Mercia, but the balance which the king desired to establish between those potent families was wholly lost, and the influence of Harold greatly preponderated. 1055. The death of Siward, Duke of Northumberland, made the way still more open to the ambition of that nobleman. Siward, besides his other merits, had acquired honour to England by his successful conduct in the only foreign enterprise undertaken during the reign of Edward. Duncan, King of Scotland, was a prince of a gentle disposition, but possessed not the genius requisite for governing a country so turbulent and so much infested by the intrigues and animosities of the great. Macbeth, a powerful nobleman and nearly allied to the crown, not content with curbing the king's authority, carried still farther his pestilent ambition. He put his sovereign to death, chased Malcolm Kenmore, his son and heir, into England, and usurped the crown. Siward, whose daughter was married to Duncan, embraced, by Edward's orders, the protection of this distressed family. He marched an army into Scotland, and having defeated and killed Macbeth in battle, he restored Malcolm to the throne of his ancestors. This service, added to his former connections with the royal family of Scotland, brought a great accession to the authority of Siward in the north, but as he had lost his eldest son, Osberne, in the action with Macbeth, it proved in the issue fatal to his family. His second son, Wulhwth, appeared, on his father's death, too young to be entrusted with the government of Northumberland, and Harold's influence obtained that dukedom for his own brother, Tosti. There are two circumstances related of Siward, which discover his high sense of honour and his martial disposition. When intelligence was brought him of his son Osberne's death, he was inconsolable, till he heard that the wound was received in the breast, and that he had behaved with great gallantry in the action. When he found his own death approaching, he ordered his servants to clothe him in a complete suit of armour, and sitting erect on the couch with a spear in his hand, declared that in that posture, the only one worthy of a warrior, he would patiently await the fatal moment. The king, now worn out with cares and infirmities, felt himself far advanced in the decline of life, and having no issue himself, began to think of appointing a successor to the kingdom. He sent a deputation to Hungary to invite over his nephew Edward, son of his elder brother, and the only remaining heir of the Saxon line. That prince, whose succession to the crown would have been easy and undisputed, came to England with his children, Edgar, surnamed Atheling, Margaret, and Christina. But his death, which happened a few days after his arrival, threw the king into new difficulties. He saw that the great power and ambition of Harold had tempted him to think of obtaining possession of the throne on the first vacancy, and that Edgar, on account of his youth and inexperience, was very unfit to oppose the pretensions of so popular and enterprising a rival. The animosity which he had long borne to Earl Godwin made him averse to the succession of his son, and he could not, without extreme reluctance, think of an increase of grandeur to a family which had risen on the ruins of royal authority, and which, by the murder of Alfred, his brother, had contributed so much to the weakening of the Saxon line. In this uncertainty, he secretly cast his eye towards his kinsman, William, Duke of Normandy, as the only person whose power and reputation and capacity could support any destination which he might make in his favour, to the exclusion of Harold and his family. This famous prince was natural son of Robert, Duke of Normandy, by Harlotta, daughter of a tanner in Falaise, and was very early established in that grandeur, from which his birth seemed to have set him at so great a distance. While he was but 9 years of age, his father had resolved to undertake a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a fashionable act of devotion, which had taken place of the pilgrimages to Rome, and which, as it was attended with more difficulty and danger, and carried those religious adventurers to the first sources of Christianity, appeared to them more meritorious. Before his departure, he assembled the states of the duchy, and informing them of his design, he engaged them to swear allegiance to his natural son William, whom, as he had no legitimate issue, he intended, in case he should die in the pilgrimage, to leave successor to his dominions. As he was a prudent prince, he could not but foresee the great inconveniences which must attend this journey, and this settlement of his succession, arising from the perpetual turbulency of the great, the claims of other branches of the ducal family, and the power of the French monarch. But all these considerations were surmounted by the prevailing zeal for pilgrimages, and probably the more important they were, the more would Robert exult in sacrificing them to what he imagined to be his religious duty. This prince, as he had apprehended, died in his pilgrimage, and the minority of his son was attended with all those disorders which were almost unavoidable in that situation. The licentious nobles, freed from the awe of sovereign authority, broke out into personal animosities against each other, and made the whole country a scene of war and devastation. Roger, Count of Tony, and Alan, Count of Brittany, advanced claims to the dominion of the state, and Henry I, King of France, thought the opportunity favourable for reducing the power of a vassal who had originally acquired his settlement in so violent and invidious a manner, and who had long appeared formidable to his sovereign. The regency established by Robert encountered great difficulties in supporting the government under his complication of dangers. and the young prince, when he came to maturity, found himself reduced to a very low condition. But the great qualities which he soon displayed in the field and in the cabinet gave encouragement to his friends and struck a terror into his enemies. He opposed himself on all sides against his rebellious subjects and against foreign invaders, and by his valor and conduct prevailed in every action. He obliged the French king to grant him peace on reasonable terms. He expelled all pretenders to the sovereignty, and he reduced his turbulent barons to pay submission to his authority and to suspend their mutual animosities. The natural severity of his temper appeared in a rigorous administration of justice, and having found the happy effects of this plan of government, without which the laws in those ages became totally impotent, he regarded it as a fixed maxim that an inflexible conduct was the first duty of a sovereign. The tranquillity which he had established in his dominions had given William leisure to pay a visit to the King of England during the time of Godwin's banishment, and he was received in a manner suitable to the great reputation which he had acquired, to the relation by which he was connected with Edward, and to the obligations which that prince owed to his family. On the return of Godwin and the expulsion of the Norman favourites, Robert, Archbishop of Canterbury, had, before his departure, persuaded Edward to think of adopting William as his successor, a counsel which was favoured by the king's aversion to Godwin, his prepossessions for the Normans, and his esteem of the Duke. That prelate, therefore, received a commission to inform William of the king's intentions in his favour, and he was the first person that opened the mind of the prince to entertain those ambitious hopes. But Edward, irresolute and feeble in his purpose, finding that the English would more easily acquiesce in the restoration of the Saxon line, and in the meantime invited his brother's descendants from Hungary with a view of having them recognized heirs to the crown. The death of his nephew and the inexperience and unpromising qualities of young Edgar made him resume his former intentions in favour of the Duke of Normandy, though his aversion to hazardous enterprises engaged him to postpone the execution and even to keep his purpose secret from all his ministers. Harold, meanwhile, proceeded after a more open manner in increasing his popularity, in establishing his power, and in preparing the way for his advancement on the first vacancy, an event which, from the age and infirmities of the king, appeared not very distant. But there was still an obstacle, which it was requisite for him previously to overcome. Earl Godwin, when restored to his power and fortune, had given hostages for his good behaviour, and among the rest one son and one grandson, whom Edward, for greater security, as has been related, had consigned to the custody of the Duke of Normandy. Harold, though not aware of the Duke's being his competitor, was uneasy that such near relations should be detained prisoners in a foreign country, and he was afraid lest William should, in favour of Edgar, retain these pledges as a check on the ambition of any other pretender. He represented, therefore, to the king his unfeigned submission to royal authority, his steady duty to his prince, and the little necessity there was, after such a uniform trial of his obedience, to detain any longer those hostages who had been required on the first composing of civil discords. By these topics, enforced by his great power, he extorted the king's consent to release them.